Hi there, and welcome to Ecochain's Got Data webinar. I'm your host, Hani Larma, and this is where we come to you with our very practical knowledge sharing interviews. They were originally recorded during our live webinars. Here we speak with our own environmental specialists and awesome clients about what is possible in the world of improving your product's environmental footprint. Stay tuned. Hi, everybody who's joining. Firstly, thank you so much for joining the webinar about beginner's guides to LCA. So firstly, why are we all here? I think a lot of us have the same questions. So firstly, what on earth is an LCA? And how can LCA help my company in their sustainability journey? So I'm Hani Larma, and for the next hour, I'm going to be speaking to you about this topic along with my lovely colleague Archam, who is an environmental specialist here at Ecochain. So hi, Archam.
Good afternoon, everyone.
So why is Ecochain a source of knowledge on this topic? Well, we've been working in life cycle assessments and impact measurements for over 10 years. So we have a lot of companies who have similar missions as you and also come to us with the same questions. So how can LCA help them, and how does it actually work, and what can the results be used for? We actually at Ecochain, we have two tools which help our clients make informed sustainability decisions based off of their LCA results. So we'll be introducing that in a little bit, but also I wanted to let you know that at the end of this webinar, we're also going to be doing a 20-minute Q&A. So that's where we're going to be answering your really in-depth questions on the topic. So yeah, let's get started. So firstly, as I mentioned, we have our two tools, Ecochain Mobius and Helix. So to get us started, Archam, could you explain a little bit about what these two tools are and how do we use them to calculate LCAs at Ecochain?
Yeah, so indeed, we have two tools which enable companies to make lifecycle assessments very efficiently and easy. On the left, we have Ecochain Mobius, which is a tool that allows a company or a user to measure and design more sustainable products. The idea there is that you really focus on a single product and what we call a bottom-up approach, where you build things up from scratch. And then the beauty of the tool there is that you can then easily make a copy, a duplicate, and start thinking about what if I replace material A with material B? What if I switch from a gray electricity source to a green electricity source, and thereby enabling you to basically make more environmentally friendly designs of your products. On the other hand, on the right, we have Ecochain Helix, which is our second tool, which basically allows you to measure the impact of large bulk product portfolios. And basically what we like to call, we make a digital twin of your factory or of your manufacturing site. And there really the power is that you can see how different processes contribute to the impact of your products. And last but not least, also you can make bulk LCAs of entire portfolios at a very, very low cost compared to other tools.
Nice. So indeed, the main things that we're going to go through in this webinar is what is an LCA, how does it work, and how can you use those results to help your business? So to begin with, the big question, Archam, LCA, what is it in short?
It's a very good question. A lot of people, I think, well, the main trending topic nowadays is climate change, and therefore people always are interested in the carbon footprint. But there's more and more needs and demands, and a life cycle assessment is a more wholesome and complete way to model and get into a picture what the impact is of your product or of your factory. You can gain way more insights than just a carbon footprint, and start steering based on other things like, yeah, the impact on the ozone layer or all kinds of other insights that are not easy to calculate simply using Excel, for example.
Right. And it's also based off of a scientific methodology, right?
Yes, exactly. So life cycle assessments is a methodology that is commonly used and is designed or built in a way such that it's accepted worldwide. And indeed, it conforms to all kinds of ISO norms, which we'll get to also at a later point in the webinar.
So, of course, it's great to know what an LCA is, but it's also really important to know who needs an LCA and why do they actually need it? What can it do for them?
Well, there are different needs, I think, and there are different reasons why you would need an LCA. For that, I think we have some illustrations on the next slide. The first one, I think, might be that you are driven by stakeholders and governance. So people are demanding that you report on things, so that you can compare your performance maybe to other companies in your sector. You can set targets and see how you're doing relative to the targets you set in the future. Then if you go clockwise, the next one then is, as opposed to governance or stakeholder driven, there is also, of course, demand driven action, right? So consumers demand that you improve your impact. The next one is the inevitable one, so climate change and simply the urgency that we need to do something. And last but not least, of course, a lot of companies want to make marketing claims or demonstrate how green they are. But if you don't back it with numbers or don't have something to fall back to prove how you're doing, then yeah, can fall into a greenwashing trap. And life cycle assessments is a methodology that enables you to back up your marketing claims.
Amazing. So, actually, we would really love to know from everyone who is attending here today what you're planning to use LCA for. So, I'm going to launch a little poll here. It should come up on your screen. And yeah, it would be really interesting to find out what your motivation is. It looks like to understand and improve my product's footprint is quite high, now at 50%. Yeah, it looks like for now that it seems to be the big one, but there's a lot of different motivations. And I think that's indeed why it's so interesting to know more about what these different motivations are and how they can help your company. Now we're kind of getting to the slightly more technical aspect. Of course, this is a LCA for beginners webinar, so we're not going to get too in depth. But Artyom, how could you explain a little bit about how LCA, so the life cycle assessment, actually works?
This is quite a, let's say, elaborate slide, and let's break it down into the two parts, the part to the left of the green arrow and the part to the right of the green arrow. So life cycle assessments, well, it's in the name. What we essentially do using this methodology is we follow the entire life cycle of a product. So we follow chronologically everything that happens during the life of a product. And as the pictogram or diagram on the left shows, if we start at the top, you start, of course, by inventorizing and looking at all the materials that you need to produce your product. You can think of it as like a recipe, right? A list of the things you need to make your dish. These can be raw materials, but they could also be components that you purchase from suppliers upstream. Then those materials will have to be transported and brought over to a facility, a processing location. So then we will look into, okay, what are the energy usages, what waste streams occur, what emissions are released, where you convert or take your raw materials components and put them together to make that end product. Then there'll be a part again of transportation, distribution, logistics. It will end up in a store or in a warehouse where eventually it will be purchased by some end user. At that point, your product will reach its, let's say, use phase where it may be used for a week, but it may be used for 50 years. We can estimate or model how the product impacts the environment during the use phase. But eventually, the lifetime of the product will come to an end. And at that point, we also consider what are the end of life impacts of the product? How do you recycle the materials? Can you reuse materials? And all these things. And as such, then there are, let's say, 6 key ingredients, key components to a life cycle. By modeling them either in one of our tools, you translate all the components that we model. So from the materials to the transportation to the processing, all of those get translated into the impacts that we see to the right of the arrow. So the model translates everything into impacts. And of course, the carbon footprint or global warming potential is a hot topic, but we also have acidification, water scarcity, ozone depletion, which used to be a big problem in the past, less so nowadays. But yeah, each sector has, let's say, maybe more relevant impact categories than others. And so by having a full profile and a full set of everything that your product impacts the environment on, you can then select the ones that are most relevant to you.
Right. So, for example, we could have the carbon footprint, but the environmental footprint, which is those 15 impact categories, would also include, for example, the carbon footprint. So it's kind of a more wide scale measurement in that sense.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay, we're going to dive into each of these topics a little bit more in depth. So don't worry, guys. It seems maybe a little bit overwhelming right now, but we're going to tackle each of these things a little bit more closely. We have the four phases of an LCA, which are the goal and scope, the life cycle inventory, the impact assessment, and then the interpretation, the last one, which is probably the most exciting for most of you. We have first the goal and the scope. So if you can quickly explain a little bit about what each of these different options mean and how you would decide, for example,
Yeah.
how to decide which one you would use.
Before we dive into this, maybe to avoid confusion for all the listeners, what we just discussed is how LCA works from start to finish and everything we take into account when we model it. What we're discussing now is then the procedures from A to Z, let's say, about the steps prior to modeling the LCA, doing the LCA, and then how do we interpret the results. Now, the four phases that we will be discussing now, they're the ones that are outlined in the ISO standards that I briefly mentioned at the start. So if anyone that's interested, you have the ISO 14040 or 14040, which is the key ISO standard, which basically lays out the principles and the framework of LCAs, which is what we're going to be discussing right now. And then let's say to bring a bit more detail into it, there is the ISO 14044 or 14044, which basically discusses the requirements and the guidelines for LCAs. So there is the principles and the framework, the general stuff, and then there are guidelines in a sub-ISO standard. And so the ISO standards lay out these four phases. And the first phase that we're looking at now is defining the goal and the scope that you want to consider in your life cycle assessment. And this is a crucial part, the starting foundation, let's say, of the LCA. Why? Because this will then eventually determine also the data that we need and the information we will need to correctly model everything that is relevant for the defined goal and scope. So far, I discussed the different phases and stages of a life cycle, which we see back on this diagram. You might think, oh, but I don't have data on the use phase. I don't have data on the end of life of my product. Does that mean I can't do a life cycle? No. So if we go from inside to out, let's say the starting or the more elementary LCA we can conduct is called a cradle to gate analysis. The cradle refers to the birth, so the raw materials, the starting point of the product. And the gate refers to your factory gate. And so if we translate that into normal words, then what we essentially do in a cradle to gate analysis is consider the environmental impact of your production of your product. So from raw materials up until the usages and emissions that occur at the factory. Now you can go a step further and do a cradle to grave analysis, where you take into account the use phase, which happens after, of course, the product leaves the factory. And you'd include then the end of life processing of all the waste that occurs due to the product not being functional anymore. And then last but not least, the cradle to cradle analysis, which we are also in the world we live in striving more and more towards. We want to go circular, we want to reuse waste, and we want to make waste again into valuable materials. So this puts the question out, how can we model and make products that later, when they are not functional anymore, can be disassembled and reused for other purposes?
Right. So, for example, if I would be from a t-shirt company, I have my t-shirt and I wanted to do the cradle to cradle approach, what would that look like?
So, well, there you would start off, depending on where you are in the supply chain or production chain, you would start by looking at, okay, what are the materials that go into the t-shirt? Well, probably some textile, right? So some cotton or some polyester, polyamide or nylon. You'll need some bleach maybe or some coloring agents to give your t-shirt a color. So all those inputs, we make a list, a bill of materials, what we call. You look at the factory. So do I use electricity to convert magically those inputs, those materials into the end product? or do I use maybe some machine that runs on gas or diesel? So those are then the production inputs. Eventually that t-shirt, when it's ready, it will be shipped or it will be sent to a store. So we take the transport of the t-shirt from A to B. It will be used by an end customer where then, I mean, the wearing a t-shirt itself doesn't have an impact on the environment, but once a week, maybe you wash your t-shirt and you put it in a dryer, and well, then you consider that that t-shirt, well, when you wash it, you need electricity for the laundry machine, use a dryer or an ironing board that also requires some energy. So yeah, like this, you basically go through those steps, make like a thought experiment, and then make lists of all the data that you would need to collect for each of those phases.
Okay, I think that was clear. And for the phase two, so that's from the data to the LCA model. What does that entail for my t-shirt?
Yeah, so I mean, before I forget, we had a separate whole webinar on data collection. So for anyone that's interested, that webinar is publicly available, and feel free to watch that to go into the data collection procedure in a lot of depth.
Yeah, that's in our YouTube channel.
To transition then from phase one, where we define the goal and the scope, what do we want to look at? Is that one product? Is that just the production of that one product, or a full product portfolio? We go into then, once we've defined that, okay, what data do I need? And on the right here, we have a simplified flowchart. A flowchart is a diagram or a visual representation, let's say, with arrows. What are the things that we need to go in? What happens at each stage? So if we go through that diagram at the top, we have, in this case, 4 raw materials or ingredients that we need. They get processed somehow. Eventually, those components will be assembled, which then gives us a final product. A question to ask yourself is, are you able to translate the narrative or the chronological steps of your life cycle into a flow diagram? Because if you're able to create a sketch, a flow chart like this for your product, then you're already very, very well on your way. And that essentially, if you have this flow chart, it's like a checklist where you can say, okay, this data I have, this I still need to collect. And that also forms the foundation for us to basically make a blueprint in our tool based on the flowchart.
Right. And for example, for my t-shirt, keeping with the with this example, let's say I have some of the information, but I don't have all of it. I don't know, for example, maybe exactly where one of the materials is coming from, or can I still make a good life cycle assessment?
Yeah, of course. So there are different ways going about collecting data or using data. I think it goes without saying that you want to make use of as much primary granular data as possible, whether it's data that you can collect from your factory or whether it's data that you're able to retrieve from your suppliers. But there will always be a little element or percentage of the data that is very hard to get, or the supply chain might not be as transparent as you wish it was. Does that mean that we can ignore it and not include it? Well, that would then underreport or underestimate your environmental impact, of course. So not including it, unfortunately, is not an option. But there are many ways to go about filling in the gaps, let's say. We have, for example, an LCA lifecycle assessment database, which contains over 20,000 unique references and data points. They offer a way to, estimate things that are not available in terms of primary data. The maybe downside there is that they're sector averages and estimates, so it's not primary data, of course, but you need to use something, and it's better to create a worst case scenario, worst case approach than underestimating or underreporting things. Alternatively, of course, we can use studies, scientific studies, or reports that are publicly available and use the information that is out there to fill in those gaps. It's not the case that you always need to, as we say in Dutch, invent the wheel yourself each time. There's plenty of momentum and things going around LCA. And so there's also a lot that we can use that has been done in the past.
And I think what you said before is really interesting, that you can also start from a certain point if you don't have everything and work towards having as much of that primary data and collecting it as possible. of course, from a communications perspective and also internally and externally, it's so important to be transparent about which data was used. So that's one thing to note, but really nice.
And of course, the way I see it is the main goal or the main aim, of course, is to provide or create environmental profiles for your products, and you want those results and you want those insights. But I think one thing that shouldn't be underestimated, or the one thing is also that it's a journey that we go on. And one of the learning points also is to find out what do you not know at the moment. So it's also that part, like getting more transparent in your supply chain, making those contacts with your suppliers, and yeah, activating people to start thinking about it enables you then maybe not this year right now to make the most accurate detailed LCA. You can make an estimate, and then you know what is missing, you can start collecting that. And in such a way, it becomes an iterative process where you can fill in and start making your model more and more detailed as you gather more data in the future. So
Exactly.
it's, yeah, a learning by doing process, let's say.
So we are on to our third phase, which is the impact assessment. So now I have the data collected on my t-shirt. I want to now really input that and make the assessment. How does this work?
Right. So what we see here is a little screen, or how do you say, a sneak peek into our tool, where basically you can take that flow chart of a product, we model it in the tool. And what happens then in the tool is that where also the magnifying glass zooms into, you convert or translate all the inputs and the things that go into the t-shirt. What are the contributions of each element? So those little bar graphs that we see show you then that the material is actually where most impact is, and actually the electricity to produce the t-shirt has a very small impact. And as such, then you can start questioning, and this is where like the interpretation and having a critical eye, let's say, at each phase is, does this make sense? Is this what intuition also we expected using intuition? In that way, basically, you can see and start zooming in on the places
Right.
where what we call are the hotspots. So what are the biggest contributors to the total impact?
That's super interesting. And for example, if we take the t-shirt example again, if I would see, for example, that the fabric that I'm using is the biggest impact hotspot, then indeed, if I don't know where all of those materials are coming from, I don't have those exact raw primary data on that exact impact hotspot, then that's definitely something that in my future LCA, I'm really going to want to collect that primary data and make it even more efficient. And also then aside from that, I know that maybe that's not the material that I want to use. If it's such a high impact, maybe I can look at alternatives and model those. We can also do that, of course, in Mobius in our tool to compare. Okay, if I would change it from this Lycra fabric to, let's say, an organic cotton, how would that look like? And does that reduce the impact, or and does it change maybe the hotspots, or how would that go?
Exactly. Yeah. So you have some materials where companies promote their t-shirts that you don't need to iron the t-shirt. So you could also make models showing two t-shirts or shirts made from two materials. What if you make a t-shirt that doesn't require ironing? What is the impact of not ironing compared to ironing over the full life cycle? These are things that you might have an insight, a gut feeling about, but you can only really see the full impact once you have modeled and see the bigger picture of the life cycle.
Very interesting. So, speaking of that, we have a really nice example for you guys. So, we have a client, Skull Candy, who makes headphones. Maybe you are familiar already with them, but we're really curious to hear from you what you think. It's another poll about what you think their biggest impact hotspot is. If you look at Skull Candies or you think about Skull Candies' carbon footprint, what would you expect the biggest impact hotspot to be on the carbon footprint of the wireless headphones? So we have a winner, which is the battery. And you guys are actually correct. It is the battery, even though we know from Skullcandy, I've spoken to them in the past for one of our podcast episodes where they mentioned that they were actually very surprised that the battery, which is a teeny, teeny component of the entire headphones, being one of the biggest impact categories. So that is really, really interesting. And we can get a little bit into why that is. And Archon, we can talk about the interpretation. So the phase four, I think probably one of the more exciting phases because you can actually find out what are the things that you maybe need to improve on.
Yeah. So sometimes or often you make an LCA and you kind of get the results that you expected. But sometimes you make an LCA and you get results that don't follow your intuition, or you get results that you didn't expect. And that's exactly then the reason why you would do an LCA. You might have an initial phase of denial and thinking, this is impossible, this isn't true. We start digging deeper into it and figuring out, well, why is it the case and is it possible? So for Skull Candy, indeed, as Hani already said, the battery is a very small component. And you would think that all the plastic or the steel in the headphone itself will also have an impact. But it really turned out that if you take all the materials together, the plastic and the metal that is in the headphone is really a tiny sliver. It's like insignificant compared to the battery, especially if you consider the full life cycle. So a battery contains a lot of rare metals and things that are hard to extract and that have a lot of impact. They need to be obtained from all over the world. So there's also a lot of transportation. There's a lot of chemical processes to create a battery. And also currently, there are no global guidelines, let's say, regarding how batteries have to be properly treated at the end of their life.
Yeah.
If you start burning and incinerating these chemicals that are in a battery, well, that has a very, very detrimental impact on the environment. And so this is activated, I think, Skull Candy, right? To make action a thing.
Yeah, so especially when I spoke to them for to be transparent, they did not calculate the end of life of this exact headphones in this LCA. But what they did mention is that when they found out that the battery, regardless, was the biggest impact hotspot currently for this headphones, they really decided to try to change the industry as well to see this big issue that is happening with the battery wars and wanting to create these even longer lasting, bigger batteries. And they were saying, hey, we're seeing the results here and it doesn't look great. So we need to change something and we need to try to create smaller batteries which are not having such a big carbon footprint. So that was something that they really took into account and is something that they are using in their future designs as well. So yeah, it
Yeah.
was a really interesting finding for them for sure.
And maybe it's nice to have wireless earbuds and headphones, but this is where, let's say, the cost benefits and the pros and cons come into play. Is it really worth having a wireless headphone if it has such a high impact because it needs a battery? Or should we maybe just go back to having cord earphones with wires because then you don't need a battery and the impact of those is way smaller than wireless headphones?
All the questions that can arise from these types of results. So, yeah, that's a great example of how you can really use those LCA results to make real change in your products and in your company and try to reduce that footprint. So, to sum up, we're almost at the end of our webinar. The LCA, what does it really bring you? Well, I think this kind of says it all. So, it builds a foundation for your sustainable improvements, and it also gives you that focus. So, those impact hotspots that Archon spoke about. And you really know, for example, in the Skull Candy example, where you should really be making those improvements, where should you be focusing your efforts, because you can't do everything overnight, right? So that's, the two really biggest benefits, I would say, from conducting an LCA.
Exactly. Yeah, definitely.
So now it's time to answer your questions. So I'd like to bring Stelsla to the floor. I see that there's quite a lot in the chat. So I'm curious to see how many we can answer. All right. So the first one, which actually was repeated quite a lot, is always the topic of data collection. We were already talking about data collection for, suppliers. And this one is specifically, do you have any tips or suggestions or learning on what's the best and most efficient way to collect data from colleagues in different departments? Because as we know, often, well, actually all the time, you'll need colleagues from different departments on board to do your data collection. So, Artyom, any tips from all your experience so far?
Yeah, I've worked on a lot of projects where indeed data is required either from different departments, or if you have a a company with multiple production facilities all over the world or offices all over the world, everyone has to contribute their part. It's always a tricky process, and because it's tricky, it's important, I think, to have a standardized procedure. We have at Ecochain data collection templates, which help create structure in this big, messy cloud of data. That's, I think, one. So asking and requesting the same data from each place to avoid confusion. The other thing is, of course, transparency, traceability, ensuring that everything that has been collected and also that hasn't been collected is documented. Because let's say you do an LCA now, and then for half a year or a year, you've done it and you just wait and want to repeat the whole LCA study next year again. After a year of doing a lot of your daily work, you might completely have forgotten how we did it last year. And that's where, if you don't document things, you might kind of shoot yourself in the foot, because the best improvements will be made if you use the same approach each time. So yeah, structure, using templates, and traceability, documentation, I think are key elements to
And then
structure.
we have the in-depth webinar on this topic. It's on our YouTube, as I mentioned earlier. So that's a good place to start as well. All right, super. Thank you. Then there were also some questions about the Skullcandy example. And one of them was that, of course, in the beginning, we said an environmental footprint covers more than, of course, just your carbon footprint, right? It has 15 plus impact categories that, based on the LCA model you choose in the beginning, can either differ a little bit, but not much. So in the example, we only covered the carbon footprint, but did they also cover other aspects, such as water consumption? And I think also Hani and I, we've been working a lot with Skullcandy. We can say, yes, they did. So of course, if you do an LCA, you will always have the results in other impact categories too. And yes, they also covered other aspects, but they did see that for their products specifically, also, of course, you can have hotspots in different impact categories too. They noticed that also their carbon footprint was very significant, so their biggest. That's why in the beginning and for communications, they mainly focus on that. But I know that they are also incorporating their other results as well. You can always have a look on their website too. They have a lot of information there too on the results. But yes, it is true that carbon is, of course, still a very big role to play in our climate. But they did cover other aspects too. We also have a case study on Skullcandy, so they can always, of course, still watch that too. Then there was a question as well about the end of life in our software, because of course in the beginning we were talking a lot about the different life cycle models, right? So cradle to gate until the factory gates, cradle to grave, and cradle to cradle. Is it possible in our software, Archon, to also include cradle to gate and cradle to cradle? So I see a couple of people gave their, for example, the recycling of a battery, for example.
Mhm.
Is that possible?
Definitely. So if you're doing an analysis broader than the cradle to gate, so if you're doing the use phase and the end of life, then you include the use phase and the end of life. But in any case, I think you would never model the end of life or the use phase in itself. So you start usually modeling the production. And then the way it works in Mobius is that you can create a template where you literally can structure the LCA with the modules that are relevant for you. You can even focus on sub-modules, which we won't go into, I think, today. But within each module, there are also sub-modules, and there's even more detail. And yeah, the tools enable you to take all detail that is available or that you would like.
Sorry, Artem, could you quickly explain what you mean by module, just in case someone missed that?
Yeah, so with modules, we refer to those key elements of the life cycle stages. So you have production, which includes then the raw materials, transportation of raw materials to the factory, and the production usages and emissions of the factory. Then you have your use phase, which will of course, have, well, using the product, but it also includes replacing elements, fixing, so maintenance, anything that happens during the use phase that also then maybe prolongs the lifetime, the lifespan of the product. That's module B. Module C is the waste processing of the product. So once module B comes to an end, then the product is not functional anymore. And module C then discusses or models how do you process all the wastes and all the materials that initially were used to make that product. And last but not least, you have module D, which is the one where you can gain benefits or loads. So if you recycle your product and there's, let's say, valuable steel or plastic that can be used in the future, then you can basically then take that into account as well. Maybe people might wonder, how do you model end of life? Or yeah, we don't know. In the Netherlands, and I think in a lot of regions, there are, as I said, guidelines on life cycle assessments. And there are guidelines then also regarding what are representative scenarios for end of life, and they vary from material to material. So, I mean, I think the most important methods are recycling. So somehow recycling, reusing the materials, so making waste valuable material again. You can burn it, incinerate, you can landfill it, so dump it. And yeah, in each region, the way things are processed can vary. And so therefore we can use studies and reports that say, hey, plastic, 50% of all plastic in the world gets incinerated, 20% gets recycled, as an example. These are not actual numbers. And so, yeah, you can make these representative scenarios based on the current state of affairs. You can also start thinking about, well, how would it be recycled in the future?
All right. So data, I see, is still a very recurring topic. Well, we know already. That's why, of course, we had the previous webinar. So, of course, we're also going to dive into a couple of those questions. But for everybody, we did a webinar on data collection, which is on our official Ecochain YouTube. So if you go to our Ecochain YouTube channel, you will find our previous webinars on there. And also, of course, on our website, you will find a lot of articles that are free on the different kinds of data and even a checklist on what kind of data you need. So you can always go there as well. And a lot of the questions I get here are people that are a bit worried about the data collection in the beginning and how big of a hassle it is. And they are wondering, do we as Ecochain also provide support with the data collection, but also with data interpretation sometimes? Archon, I mean, this is, of
Absolutely.
course, your job. So next to our software, explain, please.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think what I really enjoy working at Ecochain for is that we really listen to each customer and listen to each company, their needs, and therefore also tailor the approach we take for each client. Some companies have in-house experts or have a sustainability department, and they're really on top of their game. And essentially, they simply need a tool and maybe some training to use the tool independently. Other companies are really busy with their day-to-day activities and don't have a sustainability expert leads department. And then that's where we can also step in, and we have people like me, environmental specialists, that can take you on board, can hold you by the hand and support you throughout the entire phase. With regards to data collection though, yeah, it's very hard to generalize things. It really depends on the type of company that you are. If you're in the services sector, or if you're a company that does a lot of assembly or purchases a lot of stuff, but doesn't produce and manufacture themselves, then indeed I can imagine that data is a big issue and a problem, because you as a company, you do very little yourself. And this is where it can be tricky, and where this engaging your suppliers and discussing and talking to the companies involved in your supply chain is really crucial to get the data you need to estimate your activities. On the other hand, if you're a manufacturing site and you purchase raw materials, but in fact are processing them and making products really yourself, then I can imagine that you are enabled, or you have the data, most of the data at hand yourself, because you are in control.
All right, super. Thank you. Then I get quite some questions about secondary data. Actually, the database, one of the main databases we use in our tool is EcoInvent. Can you maybe explain how it works? Because you gather the data, and then of course you have the moment where you connect this to references in EcoInvent. How does that work? I think, of course, in our tool this happens too. So how does that process go?
Right. So yeah, EcoInvent is a database with around 20,000 what I call building blocks, little references. And these references exist at different levels of aggregation, let's say. At the most basic level, for example, you really know to the very detail the liters of diesel you've used or the kilowatt hours of electricity you've used to process your materials into a product. Where EcoInvent then comes in, jumps in, is it will translate, yeah, let's say you've used 20 liters of diesel, but what is the impact of producing 20 liters of diesel and what is the impact of combusting, so burning those 20 liters of diesel? That's where EcoInvent comes in because it has a full profile that says a liter of diesel or a kilogram of diesel has this much of a carbon footprint and these other impact categories. But EcoInvent also has references not just for the simple granular blocks like diesel and kilowatt hours. EcoInvent also has references for actual processes. So for example, if you're making plastics, then there are references for injection molding in case you don't know how your injection molding process in your factory works. We have a reference for it. And so EcoInvent has references for different levels of aggregation, let's say. There are references for transportation where you don't just look at the emissions released by a vehicle, but you also look at the capital goods. So what is the impact of the truck? And you take a small piece of the truck for you attribute it to the logistics that you're doing. There are tire and brake emissions. You need a road, right? So the road also has to be maintained. So EcoInvent aggregates all these big meta things that are really hard to collect and get a hold of yourself, and gives us really representative, accurate estimates to fall back on.
And I think it's also nice to note that there are also differences within those references. So, for example, if it's produced in India or if it's produced in Amsterdam, there's also different reference points for each of those things that you just explained. Also for global or more specific references for Amsterdam or Helsinki, where I'm from.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, one process can have a different impact depending on where you are in the world. So indeed, we have references that are region specific. For example, electricity in China is mostly coal driven, so that electricity in China has a larger impact on the environment than, let's say, French electricity, where most of it is actually generated using nuclear. So those things definitely are also taken into account. It's not like we have one reference for all electricity in the world. Yeah.
No, that would not be a good thing. No.
Good.
And for also people asking how that then works if you use a tool, for example, either this tool, but also other LCA tools, basically indeed the data you gather on your processes, on your products, on your manufacturing site, this you can then connect to these references that Artyom just described in the tool. So for material and process, you can add for your product specifically which reference is connected to that. So that's how it works in the tool. So that's after you've put the data in, you've uploaded it, you can connect it to the right references. So I have another really interesting question. Actually, this is a really, really good question. So when I want to use LCA to improve my product, always a good idea. How do I know if there's a problem with the impact of my product, right? So we saw the bars in the beginning, right? The little bars that say, okay, here's impact. How can you know if impact is alarming? Like from your experience, when can you say something like that?
So of course, when you model your own LCA, you're really focused, you're zooming in on that one product or on that one factory. But then that crucial part as well at the end of the modeling journey is to then interpret stuff. And indeed, it's from zooming in, going back to zooming out and seeing how do I compare or do to other companies in my sector. Um, yeah, this is where, well, at Ecochain, we have life cycle assessment experts, and this is where the interaction, I think, is important between us as Ecochain and the company that we're doing the project for, because the company has, of course, the knowledge and the expertise on their product. So together we can then start assessing and seeing, okay, how are you comparing or doing it compared to other companies? Or maybe there are, of course, sector reports, like this is the average impact or the average carbon footprint for the engineering or technology, electrical sector. And as such, you can then start interpreting and seeing whether you're performing better or worse than the average. And also start seeing, what if I make improvements, how will that affect my total impact in the future or in the long term?
Yeah. And that actually forms a great bridge to another question that a lot of people were asking, because indeed, if you're making comparisons to a product, another product, which quite some customers, of course, want to do, you want to show you're doing a good job. Indeed, there aren't really a lot of standards yet, industry standards that you can compare to. But as Artyom just already said, the European Commission is working very hard on creating the PEF, which is the Product Environmental Footprint Method. And the whole purpose of this method, which will probably become mandatory in 2 to 3 years, is for people to have indeed a level playing field. The best thing about this is that there will be specific industry standards for specific sectors and products that people can then compare their product to. So this is a really great development. And I also noticed a couple of questions asking, what do you see happening in the market as well? And what is a motivation for people to also start measuring? One of the main ones is also preparation, preparing for what's to come. There's a lot of legislation already, mandatory right now, but this will only increase, especially in Europe. And so, especially for the PEF, we see quite some customers who are preparing already to make sure that the transition is smooth. But for companies that already want to compare now, Archon, and that don't have this industry standard yet, what kind of tips can you give to them? Like, how should they do that?
That's a good question. I mean, I think in order to make a comparison, a starting point is, of course, to first focus on your own product, but of course you want to do it in such a way that so that at the end of that journey it is comparable. You can look in again, you can look into literature online, how things have maybe done in the past. There are often LCA studies done on an academic level that can provide inspiration, let's say, or important things that people think are important to take into account for that specific product type or sector. But also, if there are no standards, then in fact, you can also see it as an opportunity to have a say and be a pioneer, essentially, by being on the front line and contributing to determining what is important and what should and shouldn't be taken into account. And indeed, I think we know that sustainability and it's all here to stay. So you rather be, in my opinion, in front than lag behind in the future.
Yeah. Yeah. Very good tip. And indeed, also, if you're comparing to a product, make sure that you use the same model of your own product, but all the averages. I know that that's a tip that some of our specialists give as well. And always be transparent afterwards. So if you're making a claim on, oh, my product is more sustainable, look, we did this, always explain how you did your comparison, what data you used. Yes, transparency is key. Indeed. Sustainability is here to stay. And one way to make it more credible and transparent is to really tell people what you've done. Okay, well, we're approaching the time. So I think it's time for the last question. I'm very sorry. There's so many questions. I want to answer those on our socials, or maybe Zasla can even write a nice newsletter or something about these questions. So we'll definitely not leave you behind with that, but keep you posted in the future about trying to answer as many as we can. So yes, the last question indeed. So the last question. There were a lot of questions actually about the end of life. So including the end of life in your LCA. And one question that I've seen at least 7 times is, if you have these models, when do you know if you should include the end of life? And I think that is, of course, because a lot of people, they do cradle to gate because it's easier. So how does that work? When do you think it's a good idea to include the end of life, Archon?
It really depends, I think, on the product you're looking at. If we're talking about fast moving consumer goods, FMCG, products with a short lifespan and goods that keep on being bought repetitively by the same consumer. I think those are goods where end of life happens much more frequently because their lifetime is shorter. There, the end of life will have a much larger impact, not maybe on necessarily on a single product level, but if you aggregate how often that single product gets purchased and by how many people it gets purchased, then of course that has a snowball effect and can explode. On the other hand, if you look at a product with a long lifetime, let's say a road, concrete, something that gets put on the streets and will be there probably for 50 years at least, the end of life there probably has a slightly less relevant role. And maybe the example I give is not perfect, but it really just depends on the scope and yeah, the product you're looking at hand. I think that's my take on it in short.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Zasla, for helping with the questions and giving us all the summary of all the most important ones for now. Thank you so much for joining. And thank you, Archam, so much for answering all the questions, but also for the presentation on LCA. If you want to try out our tool Mobius, so that was the product footprint tool that we were talking about earlier and showed the little sneak peek of, we do have a 14-day free trial. So you can test it out on your own products. So trying to model a little bit about how your product's footprint looks like. So yeah, you can test that out. We're going to send you that also via email. And I think Sasla maybe had already sent that in the chat. Yes, indeed. So I put my email in there, and indeed on the website, you can start your free trial. You don't have to put any payment details in there. So you can really just start exploring. It's really fun and easy. Thank you very much. Thank you everybody for joining, and have a really lovely day. And I hope that we can speak to you again soon.